Hi, everyone. Thank you again for coming to our Mental Health Mondays. We are with our community partner, Ashley Fisher, and today she will be talking about community building, battling today's silent epidemics. So without further ado, Ashley.
Thank you. Thanks everybody for letting me be with you today for a short time. I picked this topic because there've been a couple of epidemics amidst our pandemic that are growing in concern, at least in our end as mental health professionals, but something that I think as a community we have an opportunity to build by having conversations like these. So before I jump in on our objectives and get going, I'm going to just give a quick overview of who I am. I'm a licensed marriage family therapist. I'm also a PhD student at Alliant. And I have been working over the last year with the Institute for Violence, Abuse, and Trauma. And a lot of what we focus on is bringing justice to and healing to individuals who have and families who have experienced and been affected by interpersonal violence and trauma. So jumping in for today's objectives, I just want to discuss the two silent epidemics, which are not so silent, but can be silent at times, talking about the suicide and loneliness rates in the United States, and then also identifying ways to reduce suicide and loneliness through community building. So first, talking about suicide, these are statistics that are current up to 2020. And we know that suicide is the 12th leading cause of death. And in 2020, almost 46,000 Americans died by suicide. And they estimated that there were 1.2 million suicide attempts, and that firearms accounted for just a little more than half of all suicide deaths. When we look at the differences here in how we understand suicide, we've learned that by looking at different factors of what makes a person, what we can kind of catch an eye for in terms of looking at if somebody might be at greater risk or might have some different factors that we would want to look out for, not just as mental health people, but also in the community, in knowing who you're around, who is in your support network, who you see at the different parts of your life, whether it's your job or your church or other parts of your community. So we saw that in 2020, men died by suicide almost 4 times more than women who died by suicide. We found that suicide by firearm for men was 2 times as likely than by suffocation. Some of these rates that I want to really bring up to pay attention to are for Black males between the ages of 10 to 24. So these are our young men, our young boys. Suicide rates rose 23% between 2019 and 2020. And then for Hispanic Latinx males in that same age group, suicide rates rose 20%. So this is quite alarming. Previous research has talked a lot about how we see that the middle age men are at a greater risk, but the alarming part about these rates that are rising is that this is in our youth. Jumping for a second over to suicide rates for women, suicide rates for females, the ages 10 to 14 and 15 to 24 have increased significantly too. So for Black females, suicide rates increased more than 30%. For Hispanic Latinx females between ages 10 to 24, rates increased 40%. For Asian females, aged 15 to 25, rates increased by 30%. Again, alarming rates of increase in our young adult populations, our teenagers, and our transitional age youth, meaning transitioning from teen years to young adult years. And suicide by firearm was also higher than poisoning and suffocation for females. One fact here that I think is really important to deliver to everyone is that almost everybody agrees, 93% of adults surveyed in the United States believe that suicide can be prevented. So even though we're seeing that rates of suicide are increasing for our youth and our transitional age young adults, we have a belief that we can help to prevent suicide. Another focal point here for suicide is that we found financial disparities, meaning that suicide and somebody's wealth equity or access to resources and finances, there is a link here that can explain a little bit more about what's happening. So suicide rates have been found to be highest among poorest people in the world. So globally speaking, we know that when somebody is more reliant upon resources provided by others, like there is this higher instance of suicide. In the United States, children on public assistance are 2 times as likely to die by suicide than kids who are not at some point in their lifetime. And individuals who are undomiciled are nearly 10 times as often to die by suicide than someone who has housing. So poverty is a vulnerability to suicide. Adding in there, depression and anxiety are most common mental health conditions that we see. More people have these conditions than other ones. We find that those are also more likely to develop in individuals who have this inequity to wealth or financial disparity. We've also seen in our research that people of color are more likely to experience wealth inequity, which we've drawn some relationship to. There's a higher stress, higher vulnerability to mental health conditions and suicide. Globally speaking, they found, though, that people who belong to Indigenous communities have the highest rates of suicide. And there's a lot of factors there that play into understanding and responding to suicide, whether it's accessibility to mental health care that we have evidence to support will help with reducing suicidal risk, reducing the suffering that can come from mental health conditions, whether it's looking at other types of resources, whether it's public assistance or reliable, sustainable housing opportunities. We know that Indigenous communities have a greater, the greatest risk through the greatest disparities, globally speaking. So switching gears a little bit more into loneliness. Loneliness is one of the epidemics that our pandemic highlighted even greater. We know that as humans, we are wired to connect. We are meant to connect to each other. We are meant to tribe. We like to survive and we like to thrive together. We need each other. But what loneliness really is this like distressed feeling of being really alone. And when you look at what's underneath of that feeling is that there's a human who has a very human need. That person is experiencing a lack of access to this connection, this community, or there's a pain or a hurt in that suffering. Loneliness has also been connected to parts of our brain where we receive those pain signals in our body to tell us we're hurting. So loneliness can even be painful, quite literally. One of the other unfortunate consequences of loneliness, though, is that it impacts how we perceive others and ourselves in the world, in that it causes us to react to our feeling of being disconnected, our feeling of isolation, this aloneness, by moving farther away from people, rather than telling us, hey, let's get connected, let's regroup, let's connect with people in our community, let's find people who are like-minded, let's, in any way, we kind of disconnect from our natural instinct to tribe and survive. And with chronic loneliness, a person can over time start to believe that people are untrustworthy or that they can be threatening to their survival. So as we see, as long as loneliness goes untreated, we become farther away from our inherent need to connect with others. So I have some stats for you that I've pulled up that are interesting to consider, given that we are coming out of this pandemic era. And we found that post-pandemic, 58% of adults reported a pretty consistent feeling of loneliness. We know that people with mental health conditions are 2 times more likely to experience loneliness. So there's this connection that we can draw here between the relationship of being alone, being isolated, having mental health, whether it's a depression or an anxiety. There's some sort of combination here that deserves attention, so that we don't have to get to a point where we're looking at why are people all dying by suicide? We're looking at how do we create an antidote to loneliness? Interestingly, men and women reported roughly the same likelihood of loneliness. And this survey utilized men versus women as the category to separate the genders or identification of identity. And they also added in some information about if you are earning less than $50,000 a year, those individuals, that group of adults, about 2/3 of them are saying they're experiencing loneliness. They also found that adults who are receiving some form of public assistance, whether it's in a health insurance or an otherwise necessary resource to maintain just that sustainability of basic life needs, 72% of adults reported loneliness. If you're paying attention, you'll probably notice that there's a theme here. There's a connection. We see that with suicide, some of those statistics that were common in suicide, we're also seeing some similarities here, some parallel with loneliness. Another component here is that 79% of young adults, that's that 18 to 24 age range, reported loneliness, and that older adults, 66 and older, had less than half of reporting a sense of loneliness. One of the interesting pieces about young adults that I found was a pretty scary statistic is that almost half of adults, that 18 to 24 range, always had a feeling of being left out. That's our opposite of our connection, right? That's our opposite of what we are driven inherently as humans to do, which is connect. So I'll pick up with young adults in a second, but I want to segue over to looking at older adults. So here's some at-risk attention grabbers that I think are important for us to keep in mind. 2/5 of older adults, so 66 and older, identified that their TV was their main source of company. That's that thing that we turn on, that screen in our living room, and we go about our day. So 2/5 of older adults say that that TV screen just playing in the background is their life button to feel connected. Another component here of thinking about older adults is that nearly 25%, so 1 in 4 older adults, does not have any interaction with another person for nearly 5 to 6 days at a time. So once a week, maybe we're seeing that this group of people is interacting with another human being. What a isolating and lonely space to be, where you're dependent on your TV and the hopeful interaction once or twice a week with someone else. Now, there are some factors that we need to take into account here, right? Like older adults that have certain health conditions, limited mobilities, difficulty with hearing or seeing. These factors are going to play into how able someone is to be a part of the world outside of their residence or wherever it is that they dwell. Older adults that live in those rural or maybe more unsafe neighborhoods, or maybe there's even a language barrier. These are all factors that put older adults at a greater risk for loneliness. So something about hearing loss that I really want to spend a second on is that when you think about it, when someone can't hear, they have no means of being able to have a meaningful conversation with friends and family unless there's assistive devices that can't always be accessed by people due to financial constraints or limitations or usability. There's less interaction that's going to happen with people because of maybe there's some shame of saying, hey, I didn't hear you. Can you repeat that? We don't tend to want to highlight things that maybe we're feeling embarrassed about. So some of these consequences of aging over time that are expected and known to happen can create huge barriers to being meaningfully connected to people, even the people that an individual has access to on the regular. Some of the health risks of being lonely include cognitive decline. So not having that stimulation, not having that interaction, not having the opportunities to engage with people can cause that decline to become much more steep or happen quicker. And we have an increased risk for dementia with older adults who are lonely. There is a factor, though, about women of color. They found they fare the best because of the substantially higher value on family and social connections. However, if there is no access to family or to those vital relationships, the risks are even higher for women of color to the sort of ongoing negative impact of being away from and disconnected from everyone else. So moving into back onto young adults, let's talk about the combination of suicide and loneliness here. Our young adults are at such high risk because when you think about what young adults, whether it's teenagers, transitional age youth, or just those youngers to getting up to 30s, right? That young adult category, that's our whole relationship development substation. We develop a relationship with ourselves. We know who we are. Our identity starts to form. We try on different hats, sometimes literally, and we figure out who we are. And then we figure out who we want to belong with and be around and spend time and share meaning making with. Now insert pandemic. More than 50% of young adults reported having moderate to severe symptoms of depression. And moderate to severe meaning that clinically, what I would see as a clinician in my office is that somebody who's really struggling with a sense of hopelessness, helplessness, sadness, questioning their sense of self-worth, having a hard time concentrating, sleeping issues, activity issues. This is really significantly impacting daily functioning. We also see that almost half of young adults too are reporting symptoms of anxiety, which is these are way higher rates than we have known in the field of mental health and healthcare in the past. We also know, as I said earlier, suicide rates for ethnic minority young adults are increasing rapidly, both for female and male identifying, in rates that are so alarming that we need to change the conversation and the focus. Because young adults are suffering from such high rates of loneliness and these mental health conditions, we really need to take a second and step back and say, how do we as individuals in our community, how do we as community members reach out to these young adults and give them the buoy, that that lifesaver that they need in order to pull them up out of this crisis? Another scary point here is that less than half of all young people reported anyone asking how they were doing in a way that made them feel genuinely cared about. So it's not as simple as those grocery store checkout conversations and just saying, oh, hey, how you doing? Oh, yeah, I'm good. Okay, bye. It's that this group of this generation of youth feel genuinely ignored or uncared for, so disconnected, that we get to come in and bring together an opportunity to have the antidote to relieving the suffering that's coming in for these young adults and for bigger than this population, right? For adults and older adults, kids, our humankind, if you will. So the antidote, my prescription is, when available and accessible, connection. Connection starts with ourselves. You have to take care of your body. You need to make sure that physical activity, as much as doctors recommend you can do, and speaking to your doctor very first and foremost about how much physical activity you can have, is the first step forward. Focus on your nutrition, that you get enough sunlight, meaning that you go outside when you can, and you get good sleep. You take care of your body, take care of yourself, so you are a viable resource to helping others. Once we've accounted for those basic building blocks, if you're one of my clients, I'll tell you it's taking care of your house plant, because we are all organic, just like our plants. Once we've taken care of those things, we need to look at our social support and our connections. So they recommend that speaking with people outside of your house, even if you have roommates, speaking with people outside of your home every day or several times a week really does help the brain switch gears out of that I'm alone and I need to stay alone to, oh yes, I'm connected, I'm a part of the humankind. Adapting to digital technology can increase our likelihood of having these social support connections, like to making phone calls, which for some, I will say, the young adult population, a phone call is mortifying. Video can be mortifying. So maybe it starts with a text message and a guilty, hey, why don't you ever call me anymore? Kind of a little nudge and text message emoji conversation, and then being able to say, I'm coming over if I don't get a phone call from you. You'd be surprised what the presence of being in someone's place really might do for a phone call. But ultimately, knowing that we've already done our first step, taking care of our body and our social support, being a connection link, we have to be the person who answers the phone. And if you don't answer the phone and you get a voicemail, being intentional about calling that person back. Let's say maybe you know somebody who's not so much a people person in general. Okay. We know that we have a whole spectrum of our relating to each other. And there is a lot of science behind my next recommendation, which is pet ownership. There is so much information out there about the benefits to having an animal that cares about you, that you get to care back about. Owning a pet, if that is feasible, which again is limited by some of these other factors, right? If somebody lives in a building where they can't have a pet, or they have roommates, or somebody's allergic to an animal, right? We have some of these constraints here. They even have electronic animatronic versions of pets. There's one called Paro. If you look up, and it's like this little baby seal that activates and responds to you in the same way you would think your rescue pup may engage with you too. So even as simple as having a goldfish to say good morning to does a lot for our ability to connect. Other pieces of this puzzle, think about how you connect with the world, how you connect with the outside world, outside of our screens, outside of our brains, but just being able to be present with what's around us. We sometimes underestimate the impact of taking a moment and just noticing, how am I breathing right now? What is it that I'm feeling? Can I even put a label to it? Or maybe I'm hungry, right? But just sort of noticing what's happening in our bodies and saying, how am I interacting with what's going on in the world around me? There are incredible benefits to mindfulness practices and meditation. And fortunately for us, thank you to our engagement with digital technology, we can have access to those guided visualizations or meditations. We have apps for them on our phones. The list goes on, but there is no excuse truly for giving mindfulness or meditation a chance to see how that can help you to connect with the world differently. Final point here is increase your purpose and meaning. Find ways to serve others, restart old hobbies, join group classes, attend local community events, whatever seems truly accessible to you or to someone else. It may just take you sending an invitation saying, hey, we're going to go to the farmer's market on Sunday, so get excited, right? Whatever it may be, but just sort of offering the engagement with the world to others and finding a repurposing in how do we build our community. So again, what can we do about suicide and loneliness, these silent epidemics? Speak, talk about them. Having discussions much like this one helps us to provide information and give strategies, just like what I did today, to help you to build awareness and hopefully fostering some type of community effort toward an idea of togetherness, right? Our human kindness. Find a vision. Reimagine what our social relationships can do for us, right? We don't have to look at things through how many friends do I have on Facebook versus how many people mail me birthday cards in the mail. Reimagine what relationships can do and what they are, and renew. Work together to restore our commitments to each other. Find the common good, and especially bring that common good to those who are vulnerable. When we bring people together, we can bring meaningfulness in a variety of ways. My final point is I offer resources, ubiquity out there. I vetted these ones and I'm offering to you 24/7, 365, 66 resources. The Suicide Prevention Lifeline, you can call or text. ShareTheStruggle.org is a grief resource. It's a loneliness resource. It's a I need to reach out resource. And then there's the warm line that you can call and you can talk to a peer who has been connected to some additional training, who can be there to listen to you and help you just sometimes feel heard and feel seen. There's other phone numbers that I put for LA County that are the helpline. And then I put some youth resources that maybe aren't useful to you, because if you're watching this, you're not a youth, you might not want to call those, but you can share them with the youth. Like I talked about, our young adults and our teenagers that really do deserve some additional TLC and support. And that's all I have for you today. So I'll pass it back off to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Ashley, for joining us and giving us those resources. And we will be sure to encourage all of the parents as well as the guardians to share this video with their teens and adolescents and their young adults as well. And if there are any questions, be sure to email us, contact us. You can email the church at pekgsuame@gmail.com, or you can drop a comment in our chat box. So again, thank you so much for this great conversation and this information, as well as specifically I wanted to highlight about the pets. I never heard of the electronic pet that could mimic a real pet, which may be more cost effective for individuals as well as more accessible. So that is such a great resource and recommendation.